Today, we are going to identify intersections using cross radials from different VORs. We will use the Oakland International Airport Solid 5 departure, departing runway 28 right. The outbound course is defined by the Oakland 060 radial. That radial establishes our path away from the Oakland VOR. Along that radial are two named intersections, Salad and Altum. The Salad intersection is located 13 DME from the Oakland VOR. It is defined by the intersection of the Oakland 060 radial and the Skaggs Island VOR 124 radial. When those two radials cross, that point is Salad. Continuing outbound, Altam is located 23 DME from the Oakland VOR. Altam is defined by the intersection of the Oakland 060 radial and the Sacramento VOR 177 radial. Where those two radials intersect, that point is Altam. By identifying two radials from different VORs, we can precisely determine each intersection along the departure. We are now established outbound on the Oakland 060 radial. At the same time, we are receiving the Skaggs Island VOR on the number 2 VOR indicator. Notice the number 2 CDI is fully deflected toward the 030 bearing. Even though the needle is not moving, that deflection provides important information. It tells us that the Skaggs Island 124 radial, which defines the Salad intersection, lies to the north-northeast of our present position. Since we are tracking outbound on a 060 course, and the cross radial is still north-northeast of us, we conclude that we have not yet reached the intersection. We can confirm that conclusion by checking the distance from Oakland on the number 1 navigation radio. It indicates we have not yet reached 13 miles, which further verifies that we are still prior to Salad. Notice that the number 2 CDI is beginning to move from the full-scale deflected position towards center. That movement is a positive indication that we are approaching the intersection. As we continue outbound, the needle will continue to move inward. The intersection is identified when both CDI needles are centered at the same time, the outbound course from Oakland and the cross radial from Skaggs Island. Notice that after passing the intersection, the number 2 CDI continues moving beyond the centered position and begins deflecting toward the 210 bearing. The needle's movement away from center confirms that we are now flying away from the intersection. Its deflection toward the 210 bearing also indicates the magnetic bearing of the intersection relative to our present position. Now let's try another example. We are flying inbound on the Oakland 060 radial, approaching the Salad intersection from the opposite direction. Notice the number 2 CDI is deflected toward the 210 bearing. That deflection indicates the magnetic bearing of the intersection relative to our present position. Also observe that the number 2 CDI is moving toward the centered position. That movement confirms we are proceeding toward the intersection. Finally, check the distance from the Oakland VOR. It shows more than 13 miles and is decreasing. That decreasing distance further confirms we are approaching Salad. Next, we will identify the Altam intersection. Altam is located 23 miles from the Oakland VOR, and it is defined by the Sacramento 177 radial. Notice the number 2 VOR indicator is now tuned to the Sacramento VOR, with 177 selected on the OBS. The CDI is showing a full-scale deflection to the east. Since we are tracking outbound on the 060 course and the CDI is deflected to the east, the direction of travel, we can conclude that the intersection lies ahead of our present position. The distance from Oakland is less than 23 miles, which further confirms that we have not yet reached Altam. Notice that the number 2 CDI is now moving from the fully deflected position towards center. That movement indicates we are approaching the Altam intersection. When the number 2 CDI centers, while we remain established on the Oakland 060 radial, we have identified ALTAM. As we continue beyond that point, the needle will deflect toward the west. That continued deflection confirms we have passed the intersection and are now flying away from it. One final point before concluding the video. When setting the OBS to identify a cross radial, always select the radial exactly as it is published on the chart. When you do, you will typically observe a from indication. However, using the reciprocal course does not prevent you from identifying the intersection. Now we will identify the ALTAM intersection using the reciprocal of the Sacramento 177 radial, which is the Sacramento 357 radial. Notice the number 2 OBS is set to 357 and the number 2 CDI is fully deflected toward the east. This is the same geometry we observed earlier. When approaching the intersection, the CDI was fully deflected toward the east, and as we moved closer, the needle began moving toward center. The needle movement, not the to from indicator, confirms whether we are approaching or departing the intersection. Notice the CDI has centered, and the distance from Oakland is showing 23 miles. That confirms we are at the ALTAM intersection. When tuning cross radials, either a to or a from indication will work. The CDI will always deflect toward the magnetic direction of the intersection relative to the aircraft's position. However, as a matter of convention, and to reduce the possibility of error, use the cross radial exactly as it is published on the chart.